The year is 2020. The Indian town of Hathras. A 9-year-old girl goes to a farm to collect fodder for cattle. On the way, she meets 4 men. They chat, get acquainted, and then they attack her, beat her, and rape her. Sometime later, her mother finds her paralyzed and barely alive. For 2 weeks, doctors fight for her life. During all this time, the police brush off her furious relatives, and when the girl dies, they secretly cremate her body without telling the family. Under public pressure, the suspects are put on trial, but 3 out of 4 are fully acquitted. The thing is, the murdered girl was an untouchable, and the attackers were from higher castes. India is a country of paradoxes. In recent years, it has become #1 in population, overtaking China. It entered the top world economies, surpassing Britain, France, and Russia. Millions of tourists fly to Goa to eat butter chicken and find themselves spiritually. And all this time, hundreds of millions of Indians are humiliated daily. They get beaten and killed simply because they were unlucky enough to be born into the wrong family. Fear for their lives is not their only problem. It is hard for them to find work or get an education. Poverty in India is inherited and turns ordinary people into outcasts. Think about it. Every 5th person on this planet is born, lives, and dies inside a caste system that controls their entire life. A system that decides who is better and who is worse, who is pure and who is unclean. Today, we're going to figure out whether it is possible to move from one caste to another and what India has in common with a prison. Why India is not a friendly place for love, and how Britain built a racial dictatorship there. At the end, we'll try to understand whether there is any light at the end of the caste tunnel, and whether Indians themselves want to walk toward it. You're watching History's Omitted, where stories don't just get told, they finally get explained. No one can give a complete answer. Not professional Indologists. Scholars who specialize in India, not even Indians themselves. The caste system is a multi-layered social phenomenon that has changed dramatically several times. Let's start with the basics. At its core, castes are social groups that make up Indian society. Today, there are at least 3,000 castes and over 25,000 subcastes. Not to be confused with podcasts. There are a few key things you need to know about castes. First, heredity. Every Indian belongs to a certain caste purely by birth and inherits their parents' status. Caste affiliation is reflected in the surname. For example, the surname Gandhi is often found in trading castes. We'll definitely talk about how Mahatma Gandhi became a great politician despite his caste. Second, professional division. Each caste is traditionally tied to a particular occupation. The ancestors of some dealt with politics, others herded cattle, others cleaned streets, and yet others practiced scholarship. Profession, like caste, is passed down the generations. Third, hierarchy. Castes do not have equal status. If you are lucky enough to be born into a caste of priests or scholars, there is simply no one above you. Most likely you are richer and better educated than your fellow citizens, and you have a higher chance of getting a top government position. Next comes endogamy. You are supposed to marry inside your caste. Intercaste marriages do happen, but they are pure Montague and Capulet stories. No one approves of them, and they often end tragically. We'll have more than enough personal dramas today. Finally, diet. The higher castes tend to follow vegetarian or even vegan diets, the ideal of Hindu food. If you're from a lower caste, theoretically you can relax. Well, not really. Relaxing is not an option. You still have a full day of hard physical work ahead of you, cleaning, construction, and so on. You won't get far on rice and chickpeas alone. Diet has a curious twist. Hinduism promotes vegetarianism. But if you look at a map of India, it doesn't quite work out that way. Some states are vegetarian, others are meat-eating. In most regions, including the famous Goa, people don't strictly follow a meat-free diet. The point isn't that Indians are weak-willed. It's that people interpret vegetarianism differently. For some, it means no animal products at all. For others, only no beef. People also stick to religious rules differently, just like elsewhere. Some Orthodox Christians keep every fast, most don't. Hinduism and Buddhism don't absolutely forbid meat, but they recommend a vegetarian diet. And the key principle, do not kill or cause harm to a living being. So, ideals are ideals. But globally, India is known first of all for chicken curry. In practice, members of different castes in India often work in the same industry. Every Hindu, though, believes their caste goes back to the creator god Brahma. According to myth, people literally came from different parts of his body. From Brahma's head and mouth came the Brahmins, the priestly class, the highest estate in India. In Sanskrit, these estates are called Varnas. Brahmins deal with spiritual and intellectual work. The most important Hindu priests, scholars, and many politicians come from this Varna. Second in the hierarchy are the Kshatriyas, the warrior aristocracy, created from Brahma's arms. Their duty is to be warriors and rulers. From Brahma's thighs came the Vaishyas, the third Varna, farmers, merchants, and artisans. The lowest Varna is the Shudras, associated with Brahma's feet. These are the manual laborers. They work the land and serve the higher castes. Outside this system, at the absolute bottom of the social ladder, are the untouchables. Here's the logic. Hindus are obsessed with purity. Those who are ritually pure, like priests, occupy the highest rung of the hierarchy. Untouchables traditionally did the dirtiest jobs. They dealt with human waste, animal carcasses, and corpses. So they were despised and considered polluted. Untouchability is not a uniquely Indian invention. Japan had the Burakumin, Korea the Baekjeong, Tibet the Rugyapa. They all have one thing in common. They worked in unclean professions. If you constantly deal with corpses or waste, you ritually defile yourself and, by extension, your entire lineage. Nobody wants to pick up that defilement, so these people's rights were harshly restricted. And now we get to the core. The caste system exists to reproduce social inequality. Imagine you're born with a fixed status and role in society. You're essentially a gear in a huge machine. You have a function you're expected to perform. You are not supposed to deviate. To keep you in place, you're barred from marrying other gears. Heaven forbid you start thinking you're equal to them and deserve more. Your life and the lives of your children and grandchildren are written out in advance. You know who you are at birth, who you'll be as an adult, and who you will die as. But it wasn't always like that. Before the British, dynamic castes and reincarnation. Historians usually split caste history into two big eras, before and after the British conquest. Before the British, castes were a more dynamic system. The hierarchy was less rigid. About 3,000 years ago, Aryan tribes came into ancient India, migrants from what is now Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. They looked roughly like this. Definitely not blue-eyed blonde demigods. There is nothing in common between the ancient Aryans and the Aryan race of 20th century fantasy. Some people did try to build theories about a super race that created all civilizations, and we know all too well how that ended. What matters here is different. The Aryans imposed their culture, language, and religion on India. One version says they divided themselves into three groups for easier rule: priests, warriors, and craftsmen. The first two fought over political power, and the priests won. When Aryans conquered much of India, they subordinated the local population as their servants. That is how the four Varnas emerged: clergy, military, aristocracy, merchants, artisans, and laborers. A draft for the future caste system. The Hindu law book Manusmriti is considered the key text that fixed this hierarchy. It literally says the only calling of the lowest estate, the Shudras, is to serve the others without complaint. The logic is brutal but simple. A laborer allegedly needs neither learning nor talent, just a body and a pair of working hands. A cleaner is easy to replace. A well-educated priest or ruler is not. It wasn't formal slavery, but you wouldn't envy Shudras. There was no way to study your way into the elite. Your birth was your fate. There was, however, an escape hatch: reincarnation. The hope of being born into another caste next time. Your caste at birth was determined by your karma, the sum of all the good and bad deeds of your previous lives. Lied, fought, behaved horribly, then dig fields, sweep streets, and clean up after cows. Lived correctly, kept all norms and rituals. Welcome to a priest's family, a village headman, or, if you're unlucky, a wealthy merchant's house. That's the trick. The entire hierarchy rests on laws that keep everyone in their place. Breaking them is taboo. Translated literally, don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong, and do what's prescribed. Say you're a Shudra, a laborer or peasant. You have two options: ignore the rules, or follow them. If you rebel, the best you can hope for is to be reborn into the same caste, or even as an animal. But if you faithfully serve the Brahmins and don't complain, you might supposedly become a Brahmin in your next life. Convenient, isn't it? The system self-regulates with vague promises of a better future life, without any deadlines or specifics. Over time, Indian society grew more complex. Economic development created new professions, new towns and institutions. 4 mega estates were no longer enough, so stratification took another step. Society split further. This is how the jati appeared, the thousands of castes. Unlike the 4 varnas, there were now thousands of groups with more autonomous ways of life. Imagine you're a shepherd in a village. Around you are other shepherds and peasants. There are also merchants, priests, maybe a village head, and a small administration. But most of your everyday life happens among shepherds. That's your jati, your caste. For you, fellow shepherds are both your professional community and your extended family. Your father was a shepherd, your wife is a milkmaid, your children will raise poultry. These people are your friends and support system, the ones who will lend a shoulder when needed. Well, at least that's the ideal picture. Reincarnation had its limits. One of the main ones was segregation. Think of how in some TV shows, gangs divide neighborhoods and punish anyone who crosses into their asphalt. Medieval India had a similar logic. The center of the village was occupied by higher castes. Lower castes lived at the edges. The untouchables had it worst. They were banned from using others' wells, from eating from the same dishes, from entering temples or appearing on someone else's streets. We'll talk about them in detail in the second part of the story. For now, how strict was all this for everyone else? Yes, Manusmriti says, peasants and laborers must serve the higher varnas. But in the pre-colonial era, there were still social elevators. Many Indians changed surnames, invented new family histories, and in every possible way, pushed their way toward the sun. That's what happened with the caste of the Rajputs. They considered themselves descendants of kings and warriors. In reality, the caste formed in the 9th-10th centuries out of a complete social mishmash. Very roughly. Say, I am Rajput, and you're in. The motivation to lie is clear. The Rajputs became one of the most powerful groups and dominated all of northern India. Who joined them in reality? Big question. But in principle, almost anyone could, even an untouchable. There was simply no security service to run background checks. So the system developed like this. Restrictions existed, but with enough desire, you could bend or bypass them. In return, people got a community, a sense of belonging and identity. It felt fair enough. And then came the British. The British. From flexible system to racial hierarchy. From the 16th century onwards, free Indians kept ending up under one foreign rule after another. Over centuries, the caste system grew and absorbed more and more groups. But back then, its restrictions didn't cause outrage. Indians were deeply religious, and everyone, including untouchables, believed their place in the hierarchy was part of a divine plan, not arbitrary cruelty. When the British arrived, though, God and scriptures were gradually replaced by bureaucracy, money, and racism. Change began as the Mughal Empire declined. Its power faded, India plunged into chaos, and people looked like lost puppies in an industrial wasteland. To survive, they clung to their castes even tighter. This gave them at least some security and organization. Outside the caste structure, life was simply dangerous. The first to exploit this were the British. Queen Victoria, who in 1876 also became Empress of India, presided over the full colonization of the country. What Britain did in India has no analog elsewhere. In the mid-19th century, India rose up against the East India Company. We have a whole separate video about it. At that time, the company basically ruled the country. The reasons for the rebellion were, in short, deep discontent of the locals. From the 18th century until independence in the mid-20th, the British heavily recruited Indians into a regular army and used them everywhere, including abroad. Service was hard and poorly paid. On top of that, many felt their traditions were mocked. In 1857, the troops were issued new rifle cartridges greased with beef and pork fat, a perfect combo to enrage both Hindus, for whom the cow is sacred, and Muslims, of whom many remained after the Mughals. Mutiny broke out. Skirmishes grew into an uprising and then into a civil war-scale rebellion. Both sides slaughtered civilians mercilessly. The oppressed showed themselves just as capable of cruelty as their oppressors. This event entered history as the Indian Rebellion of 1857, or the First War of Indian Independence. It took 6 months to crush. Around 6,000 Britons died, 15% of all Europeans in India, and around 800,000 Indians. Britain regained control, but it became clear things couldn't continue as before. So the colonizers made a clever move. Queen Victoria publicly condemned the atrocities of both sides, dissolved the East India Company a year later, and placed India under direct crown rule. On the ground, though, the same people stayed in power, the ones who had been hanging rebels the year before. But something did change. The authorities proclaimed religious tolerance. And for the first time, Indians were allowed into the civil service. That created a new problem. Britain is famous for its love of paperwork. Indians were selected for service strictly by caste. To do this, census forms started including questions about caste affiliation. The British collected the data, counted everything, and then, instead of a messy, flexible system, drew the social map of India as if it were graph paper. Naturally, without asking anyone, up to the 19th century, life was truly unbearable, mostly for the untouchables. Hierarchy among other groups was quite relative. The system was flexible, with loopholes for moving around, and groups were constantly mixing. The British killed that dynamism. They counted all the castes and lined them up at attention from bottom to top. The gap in status between elites and the lower castes widened from a ditch into an abyss. The colonizers understood they had to rule India with Indian hands, so they chose favorite castes. At the top, they placed castes that identified as Brahmins and Kshatriyas. The British considered them capable and made them the backbone of colonial administration. In exchange for loyalty, they were showered with high positions and privileges. Lower castes were not invited into this new power structure. At best, illiterate villagers could serve in the army. Some groups were branded outright as unreliable, prone to rebellion. Something similar happened in Rwanda when the Belgians split the population into Hutu and Tutsi for convenience. 70 years later, that division ended in one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. The British used their own tools for division. In the census, they forced people to list religion and race. To assign groups, officials measured height and skulls. Does that ring a bell? Racial science was popular long before 1930 seconds, Germany. The first discussions about the role of race in history popped up in the Enlightenment. By the late 19th century, scientific racism was a fashion trend across Europe. Now imagine how these theories sounded in Britain, the world's dominant superpower, convinced of its own absolute superiority. Even before British fascists showed up, you may remember them from Peaky Blinders, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli ruled the country, the same man who oversaw the transfer of India to Crown control. Disraeli's views were contradictory. On the one hand, as a Jew, he knew firsthand what imperial chauvinism felt like. On the other, he believed in a higher white race that led Britain to greatness, defended blood purity, and opposed ethnic mixing. His views fed directly into caste policy. The British essentially fused the concepts of caste and race. Logic went like this. People marry only within their caste. Over time, each caste becomes almost an ethnic group, so everything is explained by race. Brahmins are smarter, therefore they are naturally suited to rule. Peasants are servants by birth. They just don't have the intellect for more. Britain convinced itself that for India to develop properly, the higher castes must govern and the lower ones must serve, and that caste purity must be preserved so ruling talent doesn't wash out. Why did they do it? Partly because they simply didn't understand what they were dealing with. Ethnic homogeneity inside a caste is a result of endogamy. When you marry only among your own, others simply can't enter. But many castes were born from a patchwork of groups. Remember the Rajputs. We're only understanding this clearly 150 years later. Back then, the colonizers followed a different mantra: divide and rule. To keep castes from mixing and to make them easier to control, they were strictly separated. Some were elevated, others pushed down. This reduced the risk of rebellion. The poor spent so much energy just surviving that they had none left for politics. The lower castes were hit hardest. First, their weapons were confiscated. Britain did not want another 1,857. Then the authorities decided, if occupations are hereditary in India, perhaps criminality is hereditary too? Marginal groups historically engaged in banditry and theft. The British thought about it, and in 1871 passed the Criminal Tribes Act. Its co-author, James Stephen, explained the law like this. If the ancestors of a tribe have been criminals from time immemorial, then its members are destined to commit crimes until the tribe is exterminated, or its criminals are brought to justice. Again, this is not Goebbels speaking. These are British officials. All the wrong Indians had to be either killed or locked up. We're talking about India's tribal peoples, the Adivasi, the original inhabitants. They lived separately, spoke rare languages, and were not Hindus. Some groups were genuinely warlike, with charming customs like cutting off enemy heads. Those the British suppressed, many ended up as untouchables, but others simply wanted to be left alone. The police, generously funded, arrested almost anyone. Entire families, even children, were taken to reform camps. Officials were not very selective. Along with real criminals, many untouchables and peasants were labeled as dangerous. Whole villages were relocated, their residents barred from work and land elsewhere. Tens of millions of people were effectively declared dangerous and immoral at birth. On top of discrimination, the British used economic levers. They deepened the gap between castes by force. Land was massively taken from lower castes and handed to higher castes and business interests. Untouchables had no land to lose. They had hardly owned any, but many peasants and low castes were stripped bare. Indians were forced to sell land for pennies. Poorer castes lost the right to inherit land at all. Robin Hood from AliExpress. Take from the poor and give to the rich. These barriers trapped lower castes in poverty. Today, India has one of the most unequal land distributions in the world. Up to 80% of farmland belongs to the richest 10% of landowners. The British likely went even further and edited Hindu texts. Many Indians believe Manusmriti originally contained far fewer hierarchical restrictions, and that the British rewrote it and elevated it above other scriptures. The most cynical part is the story the colonizers told the world. They painted India as a child who refused to grow up. While the rest of the world industrialized, Indians allegedly played with their castes and varnas. Britain, the generous mother, shrugged and decided to bring order. In reality, it was the opposite. Britain saddled the caste system and used it for control. Most Indians were not happy about it. The real horror came between 1876 and 1878, when India suffered a massive famine. Between 12 and 30 million people died. Britain's brilliant solution? Create labor camps for the poor, where they were paid with food. The game was worth it. Economists have estimated that over several centuries, Britain extracted around $45 trillion in today's money from India, about 1,500 times the UK's 2022 GDP. The figure is rough, but you get the scale. Many priceless artifacts also mysteriously left the subcontinent, including the 105-carat Koh-i-Noor diamond, which by a happy coincidence ended up in Queen Victoria's crown. To be fair, British presence did push India toward modernity in some ways. Railways, modern education, early industry and political institutions appeared. But the main point of their caste policy was to elevate Brahmins over others. The British believed Brahmins were inherently smarter and born to rule. Who else could, in their mind, solve the problem of discrimination? Ironically, the colonizers initially saw themselves as fighting oppression and helping untouchables, but in a very British way. They were sure they could entrust the steering wheel to Brahmins. The latter knew India and would surely help the depressed groups. Untouchables themselves were not invited into decision-making. Why ask them? The clever gentleman will decide everything for them. The result was predictable. Brahmins had no intention of surrendering their privileges, and powerless untouchables suffered even more, until finally, they developed a voice of their own. Two leaders, Gandhi and Ambedkar. Given everything that happened, it's no surprise that a national liberation movement emerged. Two people played a key role. The first, as the father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi. The second is Bhimrao Ambedkar, a name many outside India have never heard. Yet in 2012, he was voted the greatest Indian in history, apart from Gandhi. Ambedkar was the main champion of the untouchables and the architect of India's constitution. Let's see how these two very different men shaped today's caste reality. Gandhi's family belonged to a merchant caste. Two things matter about his childhood. First, his mother was a deeply devout Hindu. Second, his father held the position of Diwan, chief minister of a princely state. His mother shaped his beliefs. Even while traveling, Gandhi kept strict religious practices and diet. His father foreshadowed his political career. Long before the British, Gandhi's male line had been employed in government since at least the 18th century. Ambedkar's origins were much harsher. He was born an untouchable. As a child, he and his siblings lived in isolation from other kids. Caste inequality was so strict that when young Bhimrao wanted water at school, he had to ask classmates of higher caste to pour it directly into his mouth. Untouchables were forbidden to touch vessels or water tanks. Yet he was bright and stubborn. He spent days and nights with textbooks and always felt it wasn't enough because for people above him, good education was normal. His persistence earned him a government scholarship to study in the USA. Ambedkar received a doctorate in economics, an unheard of achievement for an untouchable. Later, he and Gandhi both ended up in London studying law. It was something like targeted education. After graduation, you had to repay by serving your country. On paper, it looked great. World-class education, good prospects. In reality, in India, no one cared where they had studied. They were still discriminated against, each in his own way. Gandhi worked as a lawyer in the British colony of South Africa. He realized something was very wrong immediately. On arrival, he was forced to sit on the floor of a coach. He refused and was beaten. Later, he was thrown into a ditch simply for walking near a private house. Another time, he was expelled from a first-class train compartment for refusing to move. Even without a degree, you'd understand. In the eyes of the colonizers, Indians were second-class humans. When his contract ended, Gandhi returned home knowing this was only the beginning. He then defended the rights of the oppressed population in Africa, both Indians, and Black Africans, and returned to India not just as a lawyer, but as a political figure and champion of freedom. Ambedkar also came back to an India shattered by colonialism. People quickly reminded him of his caste. His family was humiliated constantly. His children were destined for the same. Ambedkar began to fight back. He created an organization to represent untouchables, which grew from simple petitions into massive marches and real laws. Ambedkar believed the only way to solve the problem was to destroy the caste system. And since its foundation was Hinduism, he saw it as a religion that inevitably produced dictatorship. In protest, he publicly burned a copy of Manusmriti, hardcore secularism in action. Gandhi was strongly against such methods. As a devout Hindu, he condemned the burning. By the 1930 seconds, Gandhi had become the leader of the independence movement. Using only non-violent protest, he united millions. He earned the name Mahatma, Great Soul. Together with Ambedkar, he formally represented the untouchables, but he feared radicalism would tear society apart. Their biggest clash came when Ambedkar had become a major opposition figure. He pushed for a separate electoral quota for the depressed classes, disproportionately higher than their share of the population. In modern terms, it was a radical form of affirmative action, dragging the oppressed up by the ears. Gandhi considered this unacceptable. In prison, he was jailed twice. He learned the proposal had been accepted and declared a hunger strike, ready to die if the law was not changed. The British backed down. The death of Gandhi was not just some law, it was a potential nationwide explosion. In the end, both men partly achieved their goals. Gandhi and his allies won independence. Indians fought alongside Britons in both world wars and realized they were not anyone's subjects. Mass movements under Gandhi's leadership led to full sovereignty. As for castes, Gandhi did not really want to dismantle the system. He was deeply bothered by inequality and the plight of untouchables, but he accepted the basic division into 4 varnas. As a faithful Hindu, he couldn't simply reject his culture. At one point, he even forbade his son to marry a woman from another caste, though later he admitted he had been wrong. Ambedkar didn't manage to destroy the system either. Society wasn't ready for such radicalism. He converted to Buddhism and threw himself into politics. In 1947, he was appointed head of the committee drafting the Constitution of Independent India. There, he proclaimed the abolition of untouchability and other forms of caste discrimination. A revolutionary step. The institution of untouchables had existed for at least 1,500 years. Ambedkar himself was the descendant of countless generations of the oppressed, and yet he became one of the country's key lawmakers, a space previously reserved for Brahmins and Kshatriyas. He opened many eyes, first of all to untouchables, who had never dared dream of such things, and then to snobs in the upper echelons of power. On paper, they now had to take lower castes seriously. In practice, cultural patterns are harder to rewrite. Independent India. Laws versus reality. In 1949, independent India adopted its constitution. In black and white, it states, untouchability is abolished. But like African Americans after the end of slavery, the untouchables, who now increasingly call themselves Dalits, literally broken, scattered, found that reality hadn't caught up with the law. They were still oppressed, especially in rural areas. They still drank from dirty wells and endured humiliation. Most had neither land nor decent jobs. Many turned to crime and built slums around themselves. Nothing stopped them anymore. There were even quotas for Dalits in government and parliament. But public attitudes did not change overnight. Some numbers that knocked me out while I was preparing this. Today, India has around 200 million Dalits, almost the population of Brazil. All these people have historically suffered discrimination from the higher castes. Take the famous festival Holi, when people throw colored powder at each other. It's celebrated across caste lines. Traditionally, Holi temporarily suspends some social restrictions. You can prank or even insult people more freely. But if a Dalit dares insult a Brahmin, the latter may simply beat them up, and local society will shrug. Temples? Dalits are no longer legally barred from entering. Those bans have been scrapped, but they rarely go. It's obvious why. They know others will stare, that priests and worshippers from higher castes consider them dirty. Visually, you can't tell who belongs to which caste. Almost no one wears traditional dress daily anymore. But within a neighborhood, especially in villages, everyone knows who is who. Tight communities, and it's not just about disapproval. A serious problem is caste-motivated crime. In 2022 alone, nearly 60,000 crimes were officially recorded against Dalits. Since the 1,992nd, the number of such crimes has grown 1.5 times. Yes, population has increased too, but not 12-fold. Every week in India, an average of 13 Dalits are killed, 6 are kidnapped, and the houses of 5 are burned down. The justice system often looks the other way. Charges are filed in about half of cases, and only in a third of those do courts issue guilty verdicts. Now imagine all the crimes that never make it into the statistics. One of the most shocking cases was the murder of 3 members of a Dalit family in a village in western India. Their dismembered bodies were dumped in a dry well, as if the killer didn't even bother hiding them. Everyone immediately suspected upper caste villagers. 10 years later, no one has been charged. The only person arrested was the relative who filed the complaint. Another story. A video goes viral of a police officer bragging about how she fabricates cases and tortures Dalits. An investigation begins. The result? She's simply transferred to another department. A year later, she holds a leadership post. The case is quietly closed. The police reflect society. If people see minorities as trash, officers behave the same way. And the same attitudes exist inside the force itself. In 2014, India was rocked by a story. A police inspector shot his colleague dead because the colleague, a Dalit, dared sit in the front seat of a car. What about intercaste marriages? There are no formal prohibitions. In theory, you can marry up and escape a marginalized environment. In practice, imagine you're a Dalit man in love with a Brahmin woman. Now I'll make it, you think, and prepare for the wedding. In a Disney cartoon, this would end in happily ever after. In Shakespeare, in tears. In India, it can end even worse. 7 years ago in Telangana, a 2 8-year-old man got engaged. One nuance, he was Dalit, and his fiancée was from a high caste. Both sets of parents forbade the marriage. The girl attempted suicide, but survived. The man left home. The next day, his family found his body in bushes by a river, beaten to death. The police looked at the bruises and declared it suicide. Case closed. Media called it an honor killing, typically when relatives murder someone who dishonors the family. The fiancée refused to testify against her relatives. To this day, no one has been charged. That was a man. Dalit women fare even worse. About 63% of all crimes against Dalit women are sexual. In 2016, a Dalit father received a call from his 1 8-year-old daughter. She had been raped by her physical education teacher. This is everyday reality for many women of the lower castes. Statistically, while you are watching this video, at least 1 Dalit woman has been raped somewhere in India. There are even whole castes whose traditional occupation is prostitution, passed down from mother to daughter. Take the village of Gioli, a few hours' drive from Delhi. If Ivanovo in Russia is the city of brides, Gioli is the village of prostitutes. For several low castes there, sex work is simply a family trade. Why? Their reputation is terrible. Men are often unemployed. And as soon as recruiters see which village an applicant is from, he's rejected. So women become breadwinners. They work all night, come home at dawn, cook breakfast, and send children to school. In most of India, parents dread having daughters. Over 1 million abortions a year are performed because the fetus is female. In places like Gioli, daughters are valued because they can be put to work. When girls hit 10-12, some parents take them straight to the highway. Average income? About $250 a month. The new caste pyramid? Today, castes are roughly grouped into 5 big categories. Imagine 100 Indians standing in front of you. 21 belong to the forward castes, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and upper Vaishyas. They're significantly richer, more educated, and more influential than the rest. 42 belong to the so-called other backward classes, poor and lower middle strata. This massive group is one of India's main social problems. More than half the population lives near or below the poverty line. 22 are Dalits, formerly untouchables. Officially, they are called scheduled castes. 10 are from scheduled tribes. Our old acquaintances, the Adivasi. Together with the scheduled castes, they are the most disadvantaged and receive state support, quotas, free education, reserved jobs. The last 5 are people outside both castes and tribes, religious minorities, migrants, and others. The proportions haven't changed much in decades. If anything, the share of lower castes slowly grows. Their birth rate is higher, and it's hard for them to escape poverty. Recent data show that 5% of upper caste Indians own 41% of all wealth. Lower castes do occasionally become rich, and upper castes poor. There's no iron rule, but caste and income strongly correlate. Many Brahmins are just school teachers or lecturers. Remember how much your teachers earned and have it. You get the idea. Vaishyas are the lowest varna of the advanced groups, but historically more involved in business and agriculture. So what does caste policy do? For the depressed categories, the state reserves jobs in the public sector. It also reserves seats in government and parliament. On paper, this has created professional equality. Yes, there are distortions. Dalits still work more often in manual jobs. Upper castes are overrepresented in high office. But that's not the main thing. The main problem is that private business, the main driver of growth, is much less affected. Dalits and Adivasi are underrepresented there. They do have the right to free primary and secondary education, which has genuinely improved things. Educational gaps between castes shrank compared to 20 years ago. There are benefits and grants too. Over the last 30 years, the poorer castes' situation has improved. They have become somewhat wealthier and more educated, but Dalits, as a group, are still overwhelmingly poor. Why? One paradoxical reason is that caste policy often strengthens caste identities instead of eroding them. Jobs are reserved mostly in the public sector. The private one remains out of reach. Good higher education is often paid, which filters out poorer families. Even when a child has the ability, parents often can't afford to let them waste time studying when everyone needs to work to survive. Imagine you're a woman in a village, mother of 4 daughters, working with your husband on a farm. Your family belongs to an other backward class. The state gives some extra benefits, your girls go to school, maybe even get free lunches. Are you seriously thinking about moving to Delhi to become a civil servant? Not really. You work from dawn till night and couldn't care less about being at the bottom of the social ladder. You just want to feed your children and marry them off to decent men. The lifestyle of lower castes is endless manual labor and harsh conditions. Any benefits are perceived not as a chance to break out in 10 years, but as a small compensation here and now. As soon as your official income rises above a threshold, your status changes and benefits are taken away. The result? People may actually fight to stay in a depressed category. In 2007 Rajasthan, locals blocked railways, demanding their caste be officially recognized as Dalits. Why? A party had promised them exactly that during an election, knowing Dalits received more generous quotas. The party won, but real Dalit groups protested. The budget pie is already small, and now some of it would go to newcomers. Violence broke out. 40 people died. Affirmative action is still discrimination. Constantly reminding someone they belong to a backward caste doesn't make them feel equal. Add to this the fact that caste structure remains closed. Villages are still spatially segregated by caste, sometimes more sharply than black and white neighborhoods in the Jim Crow American South. And endogamy is almost total. 94% of all marriages are within the same caste, and about 60% of the population strongly disapproves of intercaste unions. Remember the obsession with purity. If they care so much about purity, why is India repeatedly ranked among the most polluted countries on earth? Part of the answer is poverty and overpopulation. But castes play a role too. Many Hindus see toilets as sources of ritual impurity. You can't use a toilet in the same space where you pray, eat, and sleep. Even in families that have indoor bathrooms, about 40% still defecate outdoors. Untouchables often have nothing more than a hole in the floor. That's one problem. But even people from higher castes may go outside from a desire to stay pure and not be like the Dalits. People take "don't defecate where you live" far too literally. Religion, poverty, and culture together preserve the caste system. It still lives deep in people's minds. We saw this with the news about Rishi Sunak becoming UK Prime Minister. He is of Indian origin, and immediately Indian Google was flooded with searches. Rishi Sunak caste and "does Sunak eat beef?" For the record, he is a Brahmin, and no, he doesn't. Politics, however, has slowly changed. Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, was a textbook privileged Kashmiri Brahmin. 50 years later, an extraordinary thing happened. India elected its first Dalit president. To be fair, the presidency is mostly symbolic. Real power lies with the prime minister, but the symbolism is still powerful. Why the system survives, and a prison called the platform. Of course, the caste system has beneficiaries. Someone has to clean streets piled with trash, and Dalits are extremely cheap labor. The lower castes need a reference group to look up to. That's the Brahmins. The system needs motivation for people to stay in their place. That's benefits and the promise of reincarnation. And from the forward castes in cities, a comfortable middle class has emerged. People who don't want to lose anything. If you ever find yourself in India, know this. Locals don't like talking about caste, especially those who are oppressed. Many hide their origin. Don't interrogate them about their surnames or what caste they're from if they don't want to say. And in general, maintain hygiene. It might not help you befriend Brahmins, but at least you'll be less likely to catch dysentery. For us, the Indian caste system looks like a parallel universe with its own laws. For Indians, it's daily reality. To finish, I have an unexpected film recommendation. The Spanish movie, The Platform. The main character ends up in a very strange prison. It's vertical and very tall, with over 100 levels. In the center of each cell, there's a hole in the floor. Once a day, a platform with food descends from the top to the bottom. People on the upper floors can eat as much as they like. Those below must survive on leftovers, or starve and do terrible things. No one changes anything. Everyone clings to their little privilege. People flatter those above and literally defecate on those below, simply because that's how it's done. I won't spoil the ending. The film is brilliant, and it shows perfectly how systems like the caste order reproduce inequality for centuries. If you found this video interesting, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share the link with your friends and family. See you in the next episode.